you very much. My name's Hannah MacInnes. I'm delighted to be doing this and to be hosting this on behalf of the Klosters Forum. It really is a great privilege and a pleasure to have these two here together. Between them, their wealth and breadth of lived and breathed experience and knowledge of our earth, our plants, our natural world is really quite extraordinary, and their passion for these things, they've both dedicated their lives to, and they really spread this passion infectiously, as many of you will know, amongst their followers and their legions of fans, of course, too. So it really is a pleasure to have you both here. I don't think that they need any introduction, but just in case you're not entirely familiar, Merlin Sheldrake, Dr. Merlin Sheldrake, is a biologist. He's also the author of, I'm sure many of you read it, this fantastic book, Entangled Life, which we'll be talking about a fair bit. How fungi make our worlds, change our minds, and shape our futures. He also, as well as being an expert in his field, is a keen fermenter and brewer, which you read about in this book. It's quite a wonderful experience that you've had doing those things. He has a PhD in tropical ecology from the University of Cambridge, and he sits on the advisory board of the Fungi Foundation and the Society for the Protection of Underground Growth. Is that right? Networks. Same thing. Tim Smit, I'm sure, again, many of you will know, probably most familiarly because of the Eden Project, the multi-award-winning Eden Project, for which he's the executive vice chair and co-founder. He had a 10-year career in the music industry, composing rock and opera music, but then had a change of thought, and he restored and discovered the Lost Gardens in Cornwall, yes, and then he also is the co-founder, again I think we'll explore this, of the Eden Project International, which is setting up Eden projects all over the world. Thank you both very, very much indeed for being here. So I give your introduction as it's kind of written on a bio, but you talk, both of you, very personally in various podcasts and various interviews about your passions and where it came from. Tim, perhaps we could start with you. Where did this all begin? Or let's go from when you left the music industry, sort of why you chose to leave that and why you're still passionate about it and still going all these years later.
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is that Merlin's book is one of the very best books written in the 21st century. I thought it was absolutely electric. And he blushes so well. Yeah, I finished the music from the music industry, which was a blessing for the industry, and I went to Cornwall. I blew all the money I had on restoring a house, and then a guy pulled up with a white van and a carriage behind it, and he said, "You've got a garage that's not being used. I've got a pig, and it's going to the slaughterhouse if you don't keep it as a pet." So I said, "I'll have a pet," and that pet was called Horace. Horace then came in, and he preferred my kitchen to the garage. And we talked a little bit, and he was obviously quite lonely. I won't tell you how I knew that. And then we found Doris, and Doris and Horace had beautiful babies, and that made me decide. You weren't expecting this, were you? And Horace and Doris had babies in 1990, and that convinced me that my future career was going to be outside music and starting a rare breed park, and I would breed pigs. And I went to see the guy who had some land where I would have a rare breed park, and I got incredibly sensitive lips. And when I went there, the guy gave me a very hot cup of coffee, and he told me instantly I couldn't have the land, but we had to talk. And I told him that I'd once been an archaeologist, and he said, "Wow, I have need of an archaeologist," and no one had ever said that to me before. And he told me that he'd inherited an estate right next to where we were sitting, which was called Helligan, and that he had no money. And would I like to go in there, because no one had been in there since 1915. So the following day, I found myself cutting my way into a garden with machete. And about 45 minutes later, I'd fallen in love and decided I was going to restore the garden, which was actually crazy, because I didn't know anything about plants at all, except generally they're green side up. So if you're looking for the kind of horticultural line of direction, this is your man, okay? I think we're giving you the kind of lowdown on that. And then, so I just, to be very serious for a moment, my hobby, if asked what my hobby is, it's kissing frogs. I absolutely love the idea of taking something which is broken and damaged or overgrown and kissing it to life. And you know what? I think almost every single person in Britain is like me. Why else is the repair shop so popular? I'm just being serious. I think we've all got that thing, and I think the thing about repairing and restoring things is very deep in the soul, and restoring Heligan was an unbelievable pleasure and privilege, and today it's very, very well visited, and that led to the idea. Because I was so stupid, right, I had to get the horticulture director, who used to be the boss of Wisley. I'd say things like, "Why do leaves curl?" And then he would tell me, and I'd feel as if I was a dog being addressed in Serbo-Croat. I had no idea what he was saying. And he had to dumb down to a point that he was actually going red-faced with anger because I was that bad. And so eventually he said, "Well, bloody hell, if you need it that simple, this is what happens." I'd then go out to dinner party and I'd talk to people who also knew nothing about plants. I said, "You know why leaves curl?" You know, my new fact. And they go, "Bloody hell, that's interesting." And I suddenly realized there was this huge gap in the world, being a translator for brilliant minds who knew about science and telling people who knew nothing about science but would actually be utterly thrilled if it could be put into language they could understand. And that started me thinking about doing the Eden Project, and that led me to being here with my mate.
Your mate, who you just met at the Klosters Forum this summer.
Yeah, but after 2 long nights and a lot of red wine, it's quick.
Well, there we go. Yeah, friendships, lifelong friendships are formed that way. And of course, The Lost Gardens of Heligan, I had the word helium in my head, so I completely stumbled on that, is a best-selling book of yours too. And I haven't heard those stories from all the other interviews. Fascinating, about the sensitive lips and the coffee and how it all began. Merlin, much of the book is very personal. You say, "For as long as I can remember, I've been fascinated by fungi and the transformations they provoke." Just tell us a little bit before we get into now, you know, why that was, and was anyone else around you fascinated in such a way?
Well, I think it stemmed from the things I was encouraged to do as a child, like take the kitchen waste to a compost heap in the garden and tip it out there, and then to help shovel the soil that it had become several months later onto the flower beds, where it went on to create, or help create, to fertilize new lives, unfolding before my eyes. And so this idea of transformation of stuff from one form into another became very fascinating because it was so apparent. And it still is, you know, to this day, I think a lot about composting and decomposition. I talk a lot about composting and decomposition, but when I really stop to remember what it is that this is and what's actually going on in front of me, in front of us, all the time. What, in fact, creates the space in which we live and breathe, what regulates the composition of the Earth's atmosphere, what gives rise to all new living possibilities. I still think it is a miracle. And I still am shocked by it. So this was something that occurred a lot, like just seeing a log rotting, you know, over time, a log that would once support my weight turning into a crumbly thing that wouldn't support my weight turning into soil, or piles of leaves that I would hide in shrinking over time to the point where I could no longer hide in them. And so these transformations, it was explained to me in one of my why fests as a toddler.
So you're just endlessly asking your father, why?
Yeah, I mean, I think most children have this kind of experience. I'm lucky to have a patient father who would indulge me. But after a while, this why fest would lead to the fact that these transformations were overseen by invisibly small organisms. And it struck me as very odd that things that were so small, that were subvisible, that I couldn't perceive directly, were capable of such powerful transformations. And I think that's there's lots of roots into fungal fascination for me, but that's one of the ones I can remember.
I can't resist asking at this juncture, given you're sort of talking about that, you mentioned that time of burying yourself in the leaves and asking why at the end. You also say that through decomposition, you're going to eat and drink your book. Did you do that?
The eating definitely happened. Inoculated the book with pleurotus, the fungus that produces oyster mushrooms, and then they devoured it happily. I was pleased. I thought if they didn't devour it, I wasn't sure whether it would be how offended I would be. I think I'd be very offended, actually, or at least humbled. But so they devoured it, and then they produced mushrooms, and I could then eat the mushrooms and thus eat my words, which was a way of folding myself back into these organic processes, which one becomes so divorced from when writing a book. You know, most of my time was spent in a darkened room in front of a computer screen, writing about these wonders of the living world. It was one autumn, my friends were out mushroom hunting, and I was sitting in the darkened room staring at words about fungi, and I felt very silly. And this mushroom growing on the book was a way of turning these words back into an organic process.
So, Tim, you said before you'd even mentioned anything that you think, and you have a great respect and love of Merlin's book. When we were talking earlier, you said you never expected you'd be yelping about lichen. But I just wonder if you could explain why, what it sort of tapped into for you that kind of, made you yelp as you read it.
I don't think you understand our role. You ask him that question. I mean, if I have to tell you why I'm yelping about lichen, to be honest, the whole almost science fiction nature of the biological processes that lead to lichen, I just found unbelievably thrilling. And I find it, I guess, being serious about the way we are facing existential crises of one degree or another. Merlin's book served to throw up a spotlight on a world that nobody understands very much, except for a few narrow people, but with powers of such potential, I mean, exponential potential, that let him talk about it. You were talking about earlier about cement and building and all the rest of it. The potential for the use of mycelium is utterly astonishing. When we were in COP last November, Stella McCartney put on a great exhibition of mycelium-based leather goods, i.e. fake leather and fake boots. It's still exactly the price of the old, but just stunning, and gave a very good talk about it. And I think the world is in a position where we may well replace so many of the materials that we're used to, whether it be, I'd love you to talk about it in a minute, about the building blocks being made by, what's the company called?
Ecovative.
Ecovative, yeah. You feel as if we're right at the dawning of a new green enlightenment. I really feel that at the moment, as if the old geezers who are running the world at the moment could just keel over and die, we have a chance. No, I'm one of them, but I mean, I don't mean it literally, of course. I mean, Christ, there's a lot of us I'm voting for here, but no, but it's very interesting when you talk to young people. There is a tremendous dread at the dullness of middle-aged men who talk about the world coming to an end. They want to actually talk to people who've got an idea and a vision for the future, how science and social reorganization could help get us to another place. And I think one of the reasons why I found the book so exciting is that it describes a world that is almost sort of miasmic, it's just out of touch, but so beautifully complicated, and yet at once, as a big-scale thing, so simple in what it might be able to achieve. So I'm looking forward to hearing him talk. By the way, this is the only guy I know where it's true that someone says he's got a book inside him.
Can I just quickly pick you up before we go back to all those wonderful things? If you say you're full of hope about this sort of green revolution, but it's not going to happen until the men in charge, the middle-aged men, keel over and die or disappear, do you feel we have to wait for that to happen, or do you feel any hope that it will happen while they're still around?
What I actually mean, before I get misquoted by something like the Daily Mail, is there are a lot, and there's some in this room, of very, very smart young people, the next generation, and they don't come at the world as a dystopian thing. They see it as a place where actually the future remains ours to make. And I think that is the whole sentiment we must begin to express. Crikey, when you have the misfortune of spending time, well, you probably do, with politicians, and you see that whole thing about politics being the art of the possible, you think, where were they brought up? Why is their benchmark so effing low about what's possible? Brunel would be turning in his grave if he saw the limits to their ambition. And I think that's what we've got to do. We've got to light a touch paper to say, we can become energy independent, not by 2050, some mythical time. We could do it by 2030. We could do it by 2030. And what the big debate should be about is, can we or should we be thinking of borrowing from the future now so that there is a future to have? And I believe we should. We should actually have an astronomical building spurge to make us as renewable in energy and independent in food. And the world of 3D printing and everything, which I hope you'll also talk about, will be seeing a very muscular localism develop around our country and others, where we can actually be self-reliant.
I definitely want to explore with you both a little bit more that sort of the messaging and the hope and how we can have that and balance that with sort of the reality. But can I ask about something you write in your book about your sort of experience as a scientist doing your exploration, your research, and you say the forest and its inhabitants dispel any illusions that scientists are in charge. Humility quickly sets in. Lab biologists spend most of their time in charge of the pieces of life they study. Their own human lives are lived outside the flasks that contain their subject matter. Field biologists rarely have so much control. The world is the flask, and they are inside it. The balance of power is different. So I just wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that. It's such an intriguing humility that I think shapes both of your lives in what you do. You're not in control, and you're under no illusion that you're in control. Mm.
Well, it was a huge revelation for me because in the world of scientific methodologies, the language of control is explicit. You have experimental controls, and those are things you control for. So I was just very used to this idea of control. I hadn't thought much about it because I'd just taken it for granted, but I only really thought about it when I started to do field biology, and I would try to arrange experiments, and cheese would squash my apparatus, and I'd have to come and measure nutrients in the soil, and a sloth would have died there. And I felt so confounded at every turn by this place. It was bristling with life, and in an unruly way, an uncontainable, a complex, perplexing, confusing way. And I felt perplexed and confused, and it felt healthy. And it felt important that I could feel that. And it felt like I'd learned to feel that by being in the flask and by losing control of the things that I had assumed would be in control because they're called control. So this was what led to that thought. And I was surrounded there by all sorts of wonderful field biologists, inspiring people. The rich diversity of life in the forest. There are so many ways to be alive in the tropics. It was matched by the diversity of biologists who'd come there to study the life forms. And also the wonderful cast of characters parading through brave researchers trying to understand things that are difficult to understand, where they were just getting thwarted at every turn, but still trying. And this felt like a really a helpful antidote to some of the scientistic, arrogant, know-it-all, no time for open questions kind of attitudes that I had felt cruising about.
And that's when you sort of talk also about the wood wide web and it's sort of the power that it has over you. Perhaps you could explain that.
Well, when we think of fungi, we normally think of mushrooms, but most fungi live most of their lives as branching networks of tubular cells called mycelium. And so, in a sense, fungi embody the very fundamental principle of ecology, which is the relationships between organisms. They form persistent physical connections between different organisms. And so they make very good poster organisms for ecological thinking. And I think that's one of the reasons why fungi are receiving so much attention right now and capturing people's imaginations. Is because there's clearly a ripe time for a renewed sense of relationship and interminglement and interconnectivity. And these are not new ideas, of course. Most traditional knowledge systems have taken these for granted for an unknowably long time. So it's a kind of remembering. I think fungi can lead us into a remembering of something that we might have forgotten. And so the wood wide web is an idea that is a sort of affectionate term, an affectionate metaphor to make vivid the ideas of these connections between different organisms going on around us.
Tim, I wonder if you could just talk to that sort of hierarchy point about the we're not in charge, because I feel that's quite central to Eden as well, isn't it?
What are you saying? Have I just lost my job?
Can I the notion that we don't wield the power.
No, it's quite obvious we don't wield the power, and it's quite obvious that the way we educate ourselves doesn't leave us open to understand the world very much. It's really interesting. There was a book by a guy called Lewis Dartnell that many of you may have read called The Knowledge, in which he says that it was apocalypse yesterday, and you've now got to keep your civilization going. This isn't a survivalist thing. How do you keep it going? And he says, other than knowing how to throw a rock well through the window of a supermarket to forage for the first few weeks, the next thing you need to understand is soil. Because if you don't understand soil, you will die. And once you understand soil, you then need to work out what you're going to grow in that soil. And you will discover, to your horror, that the 7 most grown crops in the world today will not survive in that soil of yours because you can't enrich it with fossil fuels. Therefore, you need to find the seeds of the plants that will thrive there. which are effectively what we now call rather fashionably heirloom and heritage plants. And guess who named them heirloom and heritage plants? It wasn't people like me, it was big agriculture. So when you've done that and you've grown them, you've then got to know how to cook them. I wonder whether you're thinking, how come our education thinks knowing the kings of England is more important than that? And it's really astonishing that we've managed to grow this completely perverse culture of ours where science is perceived to be for nerds, literature and the humanities are considered to be part of what gets you into government. And yet actually how to survive and be a really healthy human being is something which is completely off the scale. How is that? Do you know?
I don't know, and I wonder in all the conversations you're having, because I know that education and that part of it, why we don't learn these things at school, is a huge sort of something that you're campaigning for. And wonder if when you have conversations with people, you feel like we might be on the cusp of any change in that. Like, might our education encompass those things? Because you're right, we all know who Henry VIII's wives are, but none of us get taught at school, unless I'm wrong, how to grow food and how to learn about mycelium.
Exactly. Over to you.
I mean, you didn't have the... I should say, I mean, because at Cambridge, there was no department of fungal science at Cambridge, was there? You would have liked there to have been.
Well, actually, I don't know if I would have liked there to have been. I mean, it's a striking point because it tells us something about the history of the discipline. There's a Department of Plant Sciences, there's a Department of Zoology. There's no Department of Plant Sciences of Fungal Sciences because fungi weren't thought to be a kingdom of their own until the late 60s when they won their independence.
Wait, how did they win their independence?
By nerds thinking carefully about the ones who paid attention and waged a quiet campaign of observation, realized they weren't, in fact, lower plants. That they were a fantastically diverse kingdom of life that could actually be part of the reason why plants exist in the first place. So the reason why I think, I'm not sure if I was in charge today of a big university that I would invent a Department of Fungal Sciences because then all the people studying just pure fungal sciences would be there. But then if you wanted to study the relationships between fungi and animals, would you go to the zoology department or the fungal sciences department? And likewise, for me who studied the relationships between plants and fungi, would I be in the plant sciences department or the fungal sciences department? And this is one of the situations that's bedeviled the study of symbiotic relationships since the term was coined in the late 19th century. That as professionalization of sciences took place in these research departments at universities over the course of the 19th century, and professorships and professionalization and students and these cohorts moving through a kind of production line of education, there were disciplinary chasms that separated the departments from one another. And professors of one subject had to be very careful about how much they interfered or encroached on the field of another professor. And this meant it was very difficult to study relationships that formed. These creatures are forming, they're performing daring leaps across species boundaries, kingdom boundaries all the time, but our system couldn't quite fit that in. So back to the Department of Fungal Sciences, I think I'd rather not have one, actually. I think I'd rather have a more merged Department of Biology with all sorts of ephemeral, promiscuous groupings and collaborations between researchers arising and falling to mirror the life forms that they hope to understand.
But do you see, either of you, it changing, our education system changing to incorporate more about your passions? Or are we going to have to rely on educating ourselves, coming here this evening? I mean, yeah.
I was on the Times Education Commission, and the first thing I would say is, of the 26 commissioners, there was no malice in the room. I mean, there was good intent and despair at how have we built a system where the common sense that everybody in this room would come up with is somehow not represented into any transformation in the educational system. We've had one success this last year, which is to get natural history, which I think is absolutely crucial, as the first new GCSE, and we championed that for about 3 years. There's an irony that about 2 weeks after we got it announced that it's going to be a GCSE, our recommendations were that all GCSEs should be abolished, which was kind of an unfortunate going. But Gillian Shepherd, who is, regardless of your political persuasion, was probably one of the best education secretaries we've ever had. I asked her during the commission, I said, what do you think is wrong with our education system? Because how is it possible we can have a system where it's so obvious that it's not an equal opportunity around the country for people to have an education? You know, how can we visit such cruelties on people with that inequality? And she said that there are two things that if she'd sacrifice her life for, would be if Britain could take health and education out of the political arena and make it in the national interest. Because she felt passionately that with each new Minister of Education, it was just an invitation for someone to want to put their mark and mess up the education system one more time with something for their own legacy. Because I think everybody here knows teachers, and regardless of anything else we feel, by Jove, there's an awful lot of paperwork in there, and an awful lot of kind of treasury-based output thinking. This is the great irony you discover as you become an old fart, which is you spend your time, if you are perhaps slightly of the left persuasion, as I am, you want to blame everything on the right, don't you? It's their fault. You then discover to your utter mystification, it's your fault. It's your fault. All of the stuff that I curse was created by people like me. And it's because we don't trust each other. And because we don't trust each other, we create lists that are tick boxes that people have to obey to show that we're being fair. And that desire to show things are fair means that we get clogged up, and more clogged up. We teach judges what they've got to judge in terms of their tariffs and whatever. We tell teachers what they've got to teach. We're trying to stifle every element of expression and creativity. The very thing we want, we're killing. And I think that's something we ought to think about, because you see it in companies, you see it everywhere, that the aspiration, which makes us an ape of the imagination, is getting crushed by some things that we do to ourselves against our wishes. It's kind of weird. Would you agree?
Totally. I was just reading today that there's so many ways we do this to ourselves. Today, a shocking number that I heard was that in the United States, 128,000 people a year die from taking prescription drugs as they were told to take them. So that number doesn't include overdoses. And this number makes prescription drugs, according to your doctor's instructions, the fourth highest cause of death in the United States, equal to strokes. So this is us helping ourselves, right, on paper. And there are so many ways in which we do the perverse thing through scaling up and treating ourselves as separable, autonomous, all the things that capitalist theory requires, free-acting individuals acting in their own interest. All this separability, all this atomization, put through production lines and scaled. Right? This is the kind of thinking that gets us, I think, to these perverse, self-defeating places.
You talk about this in the book. Sorry.
This is exactly what this is for. Please talk amongst yourselves.
You talk about it in the book. You riff a lot on what the natural position of well-being is in the human in relation to what's in the natural world and what's being consumed. Whatever you talk about, the gut flora. Could you riff a bit for everybody on that?
Well, I think it's so important to remember that, because we just take these categories for granted, but there are so many ways that fungi invite us to question the categories we use to organize our lives and politics and economies and societies. And one of them is that of individuality. And it becomes clear if you take a biological point of view, say, for example, you're studying human medical physiology, that we carry around more microbes than our own cells. These organisms have a hugely important role in the way that we think and feel and behave. And we wouldn't do what we do and be what we be without these creatures. And the same goes for everything else, that fungi have bacteria live inside them, plants have fungi living inside them with viruses living inside those fungi, and big bacteria have small bacteria living inside them, and big viruses have small viruses living inside. This is one of the most fundamental truths of the living world. Life lives within life, and that this is nested relationships, all the way up, all the way down. And so what this does is it reminds you that if you take a biological perspective, individuality isn't a natural fact, but rather a category that depends on our point of view. And I think this is very helpful for humans at this time of crisis and transformation, to start to examine the places where our carefully policed borders might become porous, or rather, we remember that they were porous all along. And what might that teach us about our past mistakes and delusions, and what might that offer us in terms of opportunity and imaginative possibility? So I think these aren't just questions for nerds, although they certainly are questions for nerds as well. But I think they're questions that really get to shake the foundations of the structures that we take for granted.
But the extraordinary, do you mind?
No.
Now, the extraordinary thing in your book is I thought it was very brave the way you deal with it, but when you talk about how you posit that human civilization and the way we organize ourselves with ritual and position or whatever could come or could have come through our engagement with fungi in the first place. Could you share that with us? Because I thought it was really fascinating the way you teased that out into a system.
Well, I think there are lots of ways, because whenever we cultivate a plant, we're cultivating a set of fungal relationships, because all plants depend in one way or another on fungi. And if you think about how important plants are to almost everything that humans do, think about every way that we depend on the soil, which is an environment created in part by fungal activity. So there are all sorts of indirect ways that we are shaped and created by fungal activity. But there are more cultural ways in shallower prehistory in which we could think about these influences. One is alcohol. And we have actually, funny enough, we have a mutation in our genome called the ADH4 mutation. It means that we're able to, alcohol dehydrogenase 4. It means we can metabolize alcohol without having a terrible headache. We have a bit of a headache, but it would be so much worse if we didn't have this enzyme. That's this efficient enzyme that became more efficient in the common ancestor that we share with chimps and bonobos and gorillas. And so we evolved the ability to metabolize alcohol very early on in our evolutionary history as primates. And it seems to have been the person who came up with this idea is called Robert Dudley, and he coined the drunken monkey hypothesis. And he says that the reason why our ancestors, our primate ancestors, evolved the ability to digest alcohol is because they were moving into new dietary niches, these overripe fruits that had fallen to the floor. And so from that point, millions of years ago, alcohol has shaped our lives. And in just looking back a little bit shallower, you have the way that ritual feasting and the role that beer and wine play in statecraft, the way that it feeds into the agricultural systems that have been made to house yeasts. Laborers are paid in a pintage of cider. All of these things. So there's so much fabric of societies comes from these alcoholic beverages, which are fungal products. Then there are psychedelics, which is a whole other story, related, but.
Well, it is a whole other story. I was hoping you were going to talk about it. No, sorry. Sorry, forgive me. But you, in your book, you talk very movingly about mushrooms, magic mushrooms, psychedelic mushrooms, and the experiences that people undergo. And you then talk about Dawkins's 3 planks as to, the 3 planks, and then you talk about under the influence of it. Correct me if I get this wrong, but under the influence of these mushrooms, you suddenly get a sense of oneness with nature or the natural world in a way that is precluded from you in a, let's call it a sober state. And you then, the end of the chapter, talk about, isn't it extraordinary that these magic mushrooms are now so prevalent everywhere? Are they now colonizing the world? And is this actually part, let me get this right, is this now part of a kind of nature in a last-ditch effort to show humans that they are part of a world rather than outside? It's actually am I talking bullshit?
No.
No.
These are ideas that I entertain in the chapter. I mean, there's definitely, I don't personally take the view that magic mushrooms are quite so simply nature's way of trying to correct the course, the self-destructive, delusional course of humanity. Because it's not always the case that taking psychedelics leads to sweet, hippie outcomes. The Aztecs, who the Spanish friars encountered when they reached South America, and from whom we have the first unequivocal descriptions of magic mushroom use, describe human sacrificial feasts alongside magic mushroom consumption. And so the values that we associate with a kind of reformed environmental utopian attitude are not those that have been shared by all those who've taken psychedelics in the past. So I wouldn't simplify it quite to that degree. But it is the case, it seems, both through anecdotal report and through scientific study, that people have a sense of their minds being larger than they were, a sense that that they can have new thoughts and make new connections through thoughts and associations and feelings, very importantly, that they might not have if they were not in a psychedelic state. And that these states of plasticity and new connection and possibility are very helpful medicines for some of the conditions that we dig ourselves into through our cultures and societies and practices, like depression and addiction, but also for healthy people who just want to be more open to what's going on around them. So I do think these are very, very powerful medicines that can help to lead us out of some of the pits that we've dug.
Brilliant. Do you want to ask a question? I just don't want to feel useless.
No, I mean, I might just jump back in because I'm going to, shortly, there'll be a chance for the audience to ask their questions, which is of the utmost importance. But I just want to sort of come back to the tumultuous times part of the sort of description of the event. And Tim, you mentioned COP26 where you were. You're not at COP27. And you also mentioned the kind of doom-laden language that's used. And I just want to explore with you both how this kind of interconnectedness that you've so brilliantly talked about, how that can actually practically give us agency and help. So, I mean, today, we're told from COP, we are on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator. It's pretty easy to feel despairing and hopeless when you hear that kind of language. On the other side, when you talk about what you do at the Eden Project, you say that you want to be a window of hope, that you want to kind of give people agency, give people hope through this interconnectedness with nature. And I just want to hear from you how that works. How do we go away with that hope and that agency at the same time as being told, well, we're on a handcart to hell with our foot on the accelerator?
Yeah, well, words are cheap. They are. And, you know, let's start with number one. The UN is a busted flush. It's a real busted flush. We need a new agency that looks after the world in a much different way. And we need new stories by which we lead our lives. And those stories should include an understanding that, at the risk of repeating myself, that we're clever apes. We can actually make ourselves energy independent now without fossil fuels. We have the agricultural understandings now of how not to farm and how to farm in such a way that we let nature give us the biggest helping hand possible. We also should be understanding that the carbon debate has largely been hijacked by accountants because they like counting. You know, so you've got 350 going up to 420 parts per million of carbon, which means the whole world thinks that, you know, it's 420 parts. We're out of control and carbon is the only thing we've got to do. No, actually, it's not about that. It's about cooling the world. It's not all about carbon. And this confusion means that everybody's made to feel completely helpless in the face of that. Whereas, in fact, radical changes in agronomy, radical changes in energy, radical changes in the supply chain with 3D printing. I was talking today on the radio about Volvo, who are suppliers, who are sponsors of Eden. They reckon that between 15 and 17 years from now, they won't have a supply chain. Everything they make will be delivered by 3D printing. At the moment, the Eden Project is looking at building a hotel with a company called WASP, who are the world's largest 3D printers. That they actually love working in clay, and we want to build it out of clay using 3D printing on our site. But actually now, having read your book, I'm thinking maybe a bit of clay with a little bit of fungi, you know, add a bit of rock and roll to the sidelines. But if you start to see our engagement and immersion in the natural world as being part of us as opposed to being apart from us, I think the thing I notice most in the world at the moment, with young people especially, is we're largely secular now. I mean, we still have the big religions, but in terms of the experience, it's largely secular, and with young people, the same. But there's this incredibly profound spiritual hunger. And I think that the return to living with the grain of nature, which sounds a bit like a marketing phrase, so forgive me for that, but I think the return to that is going to be something that young people will really buy into. How exciting is it, right? All these years have gone by. In 1969, I'm that old, you know, Hair, We Are Stardust. Do you you remember that? Well, you won't, of course. Old people, you remember that one, you know. But we are stardust. How astonishing that the hippies, right, thought we were all the same stuff, and science that was over here then has been demonstrating in terms of its understanding of the mycorrhizal system, but also the gut bacteria and everything else, that we are stardust. How flippin' exciting is it to be young today at a point where we suddenly realize we are part and parcel of life itself. And I think that's going to be the most incredibly big revelation to human beings over the next 30 or 40 years. If I was living 500 years from now looking back, I would bet you that it's going to be like a renaissance coming up.
I'd love you to reflect on that, because of course, sort of behind everything you do and your sort of evangelical talking about the interconnectedness of, you know, of us and nature, how does that help, you know, in these difficult times? You talked about a crisis earlier. How does that tangibly help people to sort of feel an agency? And what are you trying to hope that they do through becoming much more connected to the natural world?
So I think there's a few strands here, and one of the things that I think is important about studying and hearing about and discussing and involving oneself with symbiotic relationships and the interminglement of life forms is that it becomes clear quite fast that many of these relationships evolved at times of crisis. They evolved in situations where the partners that were previously living separable lives, or not quite so, were just involved in another set of symbiotic relationships. But they came together in times of crisis because together they could do something that neither could do apart. That together they could extend their reach, and they could create something which was a bit like when you mix oxygen and hydrogen, two flammable gases. You can create something completely different, like water, which you'd never predict just from knowing about oxygen and hydrogen. And so lichens, for example, are extremophilic organisms that can live in some of the most inhospitable and barren places, scorched Antarctic dry valleys, which are used to simulate conditions on Mars. These are places where no life forms, apart from these lichens, can really make a life. And the lichens can only make a life there because at some point, different life forms came together to make a lichen. And so at this time of crisis and transformation, I think this can really help to inform us, because a lot of what we need to do, I think, is to go about forging new relationships and associations with both with other humans and with other organisms, very different from ourselves. And to think about these relationships as partnerships, as associations, as symbiotic relationships, not as fungal technologies, for example, which is all very well for a while, but after, it starts to sound a little bit like we think we're in control again. Whereas if we think about it as a fungal symbiotic relationship, there's something more humble about that, and I think it's more exciting too. So I think there's a time now to think about the opportunities that we face in terms of the new relationships we can forge, which are much of the time old relationships that we've forgotten about. So I like your use of the word radical, which comes from, it's a root, going back to a root, and these varieties that you curate in your collections, and these varieties that we wouldn't have unless they've been collected and curated by careful, thoughtful librarians of germplasm. And so this seems to me very, very important and a huge, exciting opportunity, both to move forwards into crisis and to move forwards into a slightly different worldview, a fundamentally different worldview, in fact, of relationship and prioritizing relationship over the organisms doing the relating, perhaps.
Just before we get questions from the audience, could you just talk, Tim mentioned at the beginning about Stella McCartney's new form, using fungi in fashion. Could you just talk a little bit about the practical excitements and the ways in which fungi are our allies in this fight against climate change? We talk about the built environment. You know, you've talked about mycelium being used to build, and also there are just a number of ways in which people are starting to see the potential in the fight against climate change on a practical level of fungi.
You mean concrete examples?
Concrete examples.
Yeah, okay. So, well, building things with fungi, so building blocks with fungi, which replace bricks and boards. You get mycelium to grow around wood chips or corn stalks, and so you can divert an agricultural waste stream. Agriculture is so wasteful, it discards over 90% of the biomass it produces, usually. So you can start to harness some of this, feed the fungi, make some blocks, make some boards, or make some leather-like material, which can replace leathers. And the guy who really pushed for this in the early days of this, if not so long ago. His big goal was to disrupt polluting industries. Like he was trying to disrupt plastic industries, he was trying to disrupt leather industries. And so this is really exciting and moving very fast. In fact, so fast that the companies producing this mycelial leather can't supply enough. So they've got partnerships with Stella. So there's two. They're kind of rivals. And Stella is working with one. Adidas is working with the same one as Stella, and then Hermes is working with the other. And they're doing slightly different things with the mycelium to get it to a leather-like state. And it'll be very exciting to see how this all unfolds. That's one way. There's drugs and medicines which humans have been doing with fungi for a very long time. Foods, agriculture, forestry. Whenever we grow a plant, we're growing fungi. Can we start to adapt our forestry techniques, our agricultural techniques, to be more hospitable to the fact that the organisms we're growing are growing in relationship with other organisms? There are many more examples. I could go on.
A few more, cool. They're so fascinating to many.
It's really interesting because at the Lost Gardens of Heligan, bear in mind, Heligan itself is a repository of old crops. We decided it was restored to roughly the period 1870, and one of the wars we've always had with organizations like the National Trust is that no one should ever put history into aspic in the belief that you're keeping something valuable. And of course, the head gardener in 1870 would have been a scientist. They would have been experimenting with all sorts of stuff, growing the biggest pineapple, what was the best heating system, you know. I could bore you for hours about the John Weeks special tubular duplex upright boiler. So if you disappoint me, I'll talk about it. No, but the really...
People can find you afterwards, can't they?
Yeah, absolutely. If you really want to fix that, come see me. But the really interesting thing is that my head gardener came to me and he said, you know what, if we were doing this in the spirit of the head gardener of 1870, we would now be going no dig, because actually that is how it looks as if we should be going because of the damage to the soil, even though Heligan's topsoil is like 8 foot deep because it's been nurtured for so long. And it's really interesting. We started it this year with 2 of the big beds in our vegetable garden. What's delightful is our public, having explained to them why we're doing it, are completely supportive, and they think it's a really great thing. And we're showing the crops growing in no dig, in double dig next to it, and then with some additional fertilizer and so on. And it's fascinating to see the advances of each, and really, thank God, the no dig is doing very well, which is great.
I think that's such an important point you raised. There's a guy called Albert Howard. I'm sure you've heard a lot about Albert Howard, but who is, some people describe him as one of the founders of the modern organic movement. And he worked in India as an agronomist. And one of the things he was interested in doing was bringing together traditional agricultural knowledge with modern science, and to try and let both complement the other, and to improve the situation through applying what we know to what we have always known. And one of the ways he went about doing this was through demonstration farms, and he was very into demonstration, and this, I think, is so important. You're doing it there, because it's all very well with some people telling you that this is going on in incomprehensible papers and obscure journals that you don't have access to anyway. But if you can go somewhere and you can see the difference with your own eyes, and I think that's how you create powerful new narratives and powerful relationships with these different scenarios. I remember when we were young, we went to in the Mercantilist, what's it called, the Centre for Alternative Technology, and there was a straw bale that had been peed on every day for 6 months, and there was a straw bale that hadn't been peed on every day for 6 months, and the one that had been peed on every day for 6 months basically didn't exist as a straw bale anymore, and the one that hadn't been peed on was a perfect straw bale, untouched, and this really burned itself on my mind.
Sorry, excuse me. I think you've missed a process out in this conversation, because I mean, to me, it's entirely logical that if I pee on a straw bale every day,
one was able to maintain its composure, and one couldn't resist the decomposure, and so one was decomposed by the fertility of your urine, and rotted down very quickly, leaving a pile of what was once a straw bale. And the one that hadn't been peed on the microbial communities hadn't been nourished by the fertilizer of the urine, and it had remained intact. The point is, it was a demonstration that spoke far more powerfully than any other.
It's also a political statement, isn't it? If you're going to piss on people, what happens?
Right, on that lovely note, I think it's really important that we have questions from you because you can't raise the tone from that. I think we have a microphone. Yeah, so if you could put your hands up and we'll try and get through as many as possible. Yeah, so someone's got the mic there and we'll come to you afterwards and then to you and we'll get through.
Hi, good evening. Just a quick question. In the spirit of symbiosis, if I remember correctly, lichens are both algae and mushroom. They're an unusual connection of the two. But thinking more broadly for a second, is there anything that the ocean can do for the soil, the depleted soil? For example, can large floating kelp farms, if harvested, produce enough biomass to actually fertilize the soil? That was a question.
So I don't know enough about the numbers involved in kelp farming, but it is astonishing what grows in the sea. And of course, the sea does have soil. It's partly the seabed, which is a kind of soil for some of these seaweeds, not all of them, of course. And also the seawater itself is a kind of soil. It's a growth substrate. It's a growth medium that feeds and sustains and accommodates. So yes, I think there's a huge amount of cross-pollination between the two, and not just in this contemporaneous kind of world viewpoint. If you think about the tropical forests that exist now, most of them are on old, very old soils, and they're fertilized daily by dust that blows in from the Sahara on aerial rivers of air. And the dust from the Sahara was once the seabed. And so there are ways that the sea and the land are in constant fluid exchange, both now and over long time periods.
Hello. Hi. Thank you so much. I'm so excited. Like everything you've said has resonated so much. I can tell everyone around me with all the yeses and hums and thoughts. Everyone's really enjoyed it. And I'm an avid no-dig gardener myself. And my 2-year-old daughter's favorite thing to do is to look at the compost heap. But aside from that, you had so many beautiful stories of romance and relationships with fungi. And you allude to these sort of super complex systems. But mycelium's being industrialized to feed the billions, and it's part of my day job, and I'm super interested in it. But what pitfalls and unintended consequences do you think we need to be aware of as we transition those mycelium from their native environments in woodlands into steel vats?
Yeah, so first of all, I like to think of all domestication relationships as being a two-way street. It's part of this control thing. You know, we like to think of ourselves as the domesticators, but and this is an idea that Michael Pollan made very famous in his book, The Botany of Desire. I find it very helpful. But the organism is domesticating us as well at the same time, because so with humans putting mycelium in vats, we're going out of our way to create huge facilities, diverting huge quantities of biomass to feed these fungal appetites. We're propagating these fungi on a vast scale, excluding all their competitors, making a perfect environment for them. So I think in some way we've been recruited by the fungi, just like they recruited termites and leafcutter ants to grow them at the expense of all else in monocultures, in monumental mounds. So part of it, I write off like that, and I say, oh great, fungi are at least partly in charge here. There are definitely pitfalls. Some of those pitfalls would be it's classic monoculture stories, so growing a very, very few strains of very, very few fungi. And not maintaining diverse libraries, culture libraries. These strains then escaping to wild situations and driving out the local strains. And the diversity of these organisms can be threatened by preponderance of hyper-competitive individuals. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. As always with these things, when we destroy ecosystems and when we destroy environments, we're burning the library. We're burning the library of different ways to rise to the challenge of living. And I think this is a pitfall that we continually fall into, and I can see us falling into it in this situation, even if the fungi are domesticating us at the same time.
Hi, this is really actually funny because I had a very similar question, so maybe that also works through this field. I'm also working with biofabrication. I work as an artist, working with mycelium directly, and the thought that really comes is that, are we using the same consciousness of extraction, what we're doing now to nature? are we vulnerable the same way to extract from mycelium as we create these companies? Can we also change the relationality completely? Can we perceive it not just as extractive material, but at the same time have a certain reverence and respect?
Yeah, Tim, you go.
That's right. Ask the ignorant person first. I'll answer it with an observation that George Monbiot's recent book, Regenesis, has this. It has the best first third of a book, a rather middle of the book, and an extraordinary summary at the end that the only way forward is through fermentation technology, that's the only way to feed the world. And if that's true, bloody fantastic. Just imagine fermentation technology portable in every country of the world so nobody needs to starve anymore. We will farm the air. It's true, isn't it?
Outrageous. I'm a keen fermenter, and so any story that ends with fermentation being the be-all and end-all is I have a soft spot for. So I'm a biased commentator on this thing, on this question. But I think this is a really old one, isn't it? Can we be respectful cooperators, collaborators? And I think certainly it's possible. For sure it's possible. It's been possible it's possible in so many different places in the world right now. So many different types of cultivator from so many different types of tradition and all of these merging of different traditions and agricultural cultures that's happening all over the world. It's a very exciting situation, and there's lots of respect that can be built in. And there's also situations where where businesses meet the cold, hard reality of a late capitalist framework, which is sometimes not very pliable. And sometimes they'll be forced to pack their values into prefabricated arrangements, and will have to become maybe more ferocious about who they're serving in their business. It's not always the case at all, but I think it just will crumble both ways, and we're always going to see it crumbling both ways on the sort of spectrum between them. So, but the short answer to the question is yes, I think it's possible.
Where's the microphone? Oh yeah, brilliant.
Thank you so much for a brilliant talk. On the farming and soil angle, a lot of decriers of regenerative farming argue that if you are storing carbon in soil, it's not consistent storing. It could lose out. It could evaporate back into the air. And there's this kind of carbon tunnel vision, I find, when we're talking about climate. And yet, another book I'm reading at the moment by Nicole Masters on soil talks about this ongoing relationship of photosynthesis and sucking in of carbon in good, healthy soil with lots of mycorrhizal networks. And I just wondered what's your thinking on this, on the relationship between healthy soil and the ability to cool planets and sink carbon in a more long-term way than some detractors would say.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, isn't it? I mean, soils are certainly a place where carbon lives. A lot of carbon lives. There's more carbon in the soil than there is in all the biomass of plants and the atmosphere combined. It's the largest terrestrial store of carbon. But I think we get confused when we bring our kind of accountancy mode, like Tim was talking about, to the situation, because even though there might be carbon that's in the soil that might not have a long residence time, it's called in the speak, but it's still in the soil for a time. And if you think less about the carbon that goes in there, like a gold ingot going into a bank, and that very same gold ingot is only it's being saved if it's still in that very same bank vault, but rather that you have a system through which carbon is passing. And if you have a very, very, very large sponge through which a lot of carbon is passing, even if that carbon leaves, you still have a very large sponge in which that carbon spends some time. And if you can make that sponge very, very large, even larger, then more carbon will spend more of its life in the soil. And so if we take a processual view, I think it becomes a more exciting situation, because you have to think about the organisms that are conducting the processes as much as the carbon itself. And I find it all gets more exciting when I think about the organisms conducting the carbon.
But you know, the weird thing about this is that I know a farm in County Meath where it was completely derelict. The land was almost dead, no worms, no nothing. And they injected 600 acres with pig's piss, having taken the ammonia out of it, and then imported worms. And that land is now absolutely seething, absolutely seething. They do regenerative farming. I mean, there is a big debate. If you read the George Monbiot book, he sees regenerative farming as being a plot, that in fact it may be better than mass farming with livestock, but actually, as far as he's concerned, all livestock farming, except for a little bit of heritage cattle growing for curiosity, should stop, because actually you will be able to sequester far more carbon. All I would say is that that farm, with people that I know doing it, when I went there 4 years ago, it could absorb literally 1 gallon per meter square of water when you poured it on it. Today, it will absorb 20 gallons. And the wealth of it, it's amazing. And the reason he's doing it is because it's on the bend in the River Boyne, which is a sacred river in Ireland, right by for those of you who know prehistory or Southern Ireland, you've got Newgrange, Douth, and Knowth, the three, one of the greatest prehistoric sites certainly in Northern Europe. And this guy, he's restoring the land, and on top of that, he's not restoring his house. The only thing he's restored is the point-to-point racing track, because all Irish people like point-to-point racing. And you know why he's done that? Because he's invited all the farmers for the last 4 years from 30 miles up the River Boyne Valley to come for the point-to-point. And when they come there, they say, "What's the cost?" And he says, "It is 5 minutes silence." And they come, and when it's the time the racing is over, there's a 5-minute silence, and the owner gets up on a table. And the marquee, they lift the side of it so you can actually see the 2 huge funerary mounds. And he just says to them in this brilliant Irish brogue, which I won't seek to copy, he says, "Our ancestors in there, and they would die of shame if they knew how we'd been farming this land and destroying our sacred river. We must change." 4 years later, almost every farm up the whole of that Boyne Valley has gone organic, because the connection was made to real people, ancestors, the past. Most of this, there's a parable in Merlin's book which is about connection. When you see the connections both going backward and going forward, it gives reason, it gives belonging. And at the risk of digressing and hogging, we have a guy called Dr. William Bird who works with us on our social prescription work at Eden. A lot of work getting people out into the countryside. And he made this amazing speech in Eastbourne 3 weeks ago, talking to 500 civil servants and headmasters. He said, "I'm a medical doctor." And he said, "I don't actually mind that much if a patient tells me he or she smokes. I really don't mind that much if they drink more than is good for them, nor yet if they take drugs. And you know why? Because the biggest killer in our country by miles, by more than 100 times, is loneliness, a lack of a sense of belonging, and a lack of sense of purpose. And all that is about connection. And I think there's a parable with that and the land and why your book is so powerful, because ultimately it's about what are the ties that bind, what are the cultural things that make that belonging real for a wider and wider group of people. And it's the same question for education, isn't it? It's the same question for everything we value. How do you create the glue that stops people being drifted off and asunder and going into those poor conditions?
Hi. So I have a slightly philosophical question to ask. When you think of your book and how it talks so powerfully about fungus and how they are so much bigger than what we are, but also how we are made of fungus effectively in many ways. I guess I want to ask you how you think, where you think the tipping points are for society. So it's a quite big question, which is, both of you have been talking about how we save the planet, when shouldn't we be asking how we save ourselves? Because if what you say is true, the planet will continue. It's just us that won't continue. And is that necessarily a bad thing that we don't continue? Maybe a bit of an acceptance about that might be a good thing. And whether both of you think we'll miss that tipping point where we understand enough to save ourselves.
First of all, I never myself used the language of saving the planet. I think it leads us, it certainly leads me, in my mind, in the wrong direction and puts my thoughts and my feelings on grounds that feels unfirm. Because, as you say, the history of life is a history of recovery from mass extinctions, some of which exterminated over 95% of all existing species. And so the idea of the planet being at risk itself, it doesn't feel to me like a serious concern. It feels like Hollywood language that puts us in the role of Hollywood stars to be able to go and solve a problem that we ourselves have confected. And I don't like the hypocrisy, and I don't like the arrogance. And other things too. But
speak your mind.
But so first of all, that the question about where the tipping points are, I haven't got a clue, and I think that's the problem with tipping points, is that we don't know really where they are until it's too late. And if we did, then things would be much easier. But they're part of non-linear dynamical systems where things get out of control very fast, and you enter these states of catastrophic change. One of the parts of George Monbiot's book that I really enjoyed, actually, Regenesis, was a kind of passing remark where he talked about how we talk about all these negative tipping points, like permafrost melt and stuff, where you have these feedback cycles that speed up and up. But we don't talk about the ways that these tipping points could work in our favor, like the collapse of polluting industries, for example. And so tipping points could work both ways for us, and very, very rapid positive change is possible, just as very, very rapid negative change is also possible. So that's a thought about the tipping points, even though I can't answer your very reasonable question that I've spent nights tossing and turning about as well.
God, he avoided that like a smoothie, didn't he? That was just so cool. Well, I mean,
your turn.
Well, no, all I would say is, quoting my learned friend over here, and I'm going to really upset him here, I love the bit about zombie ants. That's really good. The zombie ants are really good. And in answer to the philosophical question, in your honest opinion, have we been taken over? Are we aliens now?
Well,
is it possible?
You mean, are we aliens?
You just said he avoided the question.
First of all, that was a much less subtle way of avoiding the question. You did the classic politicians thing, like turn it back. But so frame your question, please, more precisely, because alien refers to otherness. And so are we aliens with regard to who?
The thing that we think is us.
Are we aliens to ourselves?
Yes.
Good question.
I think I quite clearly understand my role in this conversation, to be the foil to your genius.
I'm not going to start on that one. No, you start on that one.
No, seriously, I was really interested, because a lot of what you talk about is you avoided also the issue of lichen. I was really looking for. I think it's one of the most sexy stories I've ever heard, and you just kind of brushed over it.
I didn't. No one asked me directly. I was happy to talk about lichen until the entire session.
Tim, we've got 5 minutes. Which lichen story would you like him to enlighten us on?
I'd like him to talk about the genius and miracle that is lichen, and what that might suggest to future collaborative working, and how zombie ants, how zombie ants relate to the potential for humans being taken over by alien life forms. I thought I'd just, get it out there.
So I think that will be a perfect couple of places to finish off.
But I think I really like the way that you picked up on the lichens being sexy, because I really do think it's sexiness. It's intimacy on the most astonishing level, like through deep evolutionary time, through these. Lynn Margulis describes them as the intimacy of strangers, the long-lasting intimacy of strangers, the coming together and staying together of these organisms, sharing a bodily space in a way which is collaborative, as an alloy of competition and cooperation. They create something which neither could create by themselves. It is a kind of embodied eros, rolling through time. And so I completely agree with your assessment. And like I said earlier about the symbiotic relationships being something we might take inspiration from at this time of crisis, I think lichens are the poster organisms for symbiotic relationships. And Trevor Goward, an amazing lichenologist in Canada, he has a website called The Ways of Enlikenment. And he describes the lichen rod effect. And the likening rod effect is when lichens, in their weirdness and strangeness, when they strike familiar concepts, splintering them into twisted forms and revealing new surfaces, new food for thought, new food for feeling, ways of being. And so I think really this gets to the core of the lichen thing for me. It is like that. It's a wild thing both to observe this taking place, and it's a wild thing feeling that this is possible in myself and in my relationships. So with the zombie ants, I think it's a really good question to ask about the control thing, as we discussed. And there's a whole field called neuromicrobiology, which has arisen to study the ways that our gut microbes might influence our behaviors and our feelings. Not just our immune systems, which of course relate to our behavior and our feeling, but the way that we actually go about in our world as sensey, feeling, relating beings may be influenced by all of these neurotransmitters produced by the beasts in our gut. And there are wild experiments with mice where you give the shit from depressed mice to non-depressed mice and then watch their behaviors change. And this is all, this is a blossoming field. So I would say that we're all under the influence all the time from creatures that aren't us. And sometimes it's embodied and very literal like gut microbes, and sometimes it's just feeling calm when we're standing next to a plant. Or being comforted by a dog. Really simple things that we are being in some way controlled, even though that control doesn't always have the kind of iron force that it sometimes can do. It can be a coaxing, an invitation. So yeah, that's what I would say.
We might have time for just one more question yet.
I would say it's already more accepted in the public right now that fungus, they are partners and they are not anymore bacillus and fungus are our enemies. But what I wanted to ask you is, in your book, are you also mentioning the potential of fungus to connect under the earth, that plants are connected by fungus and get the information and can react when in kilometers away one plant is destroyed or hurt, others are reacting and they are far, far away. So this connecting issue and this information issue, and how might we can learn from that?
So I think one of the things is that we actually don't know very much about what these fungi are doing in these networks outside in forests and in wild ecosystems. Most of what we know comes from pots in greenhouses or dishes in labs, and it's extremely difficult to observe what's going on between fungi, these rich communities of fungi and bacteria and viruses everywhere in these labyrinthine environments of the soil with all these different plant roots all going on at once. We really don't know much. And a lot of the things that have become very popular stories about plants being sharing and caring and helping each other in these ways have maybe drifted a little bit farther from the evidence base than we might like to think. And that really, I see these discoveries as telling us that there is a wild world there that we don't yet understand. So I'd be cautious about deriving too many lessons and conclusions too soon, although apart from the lesson of interconnectivity, right, which is fundamental. But I'm always a bit wary to try and make the fungi into some kind of utopian, wise, feudal broker of the ecosystem, because they're ferocious, opportunistic in other ways too, and cause huge problems for both plants and animals and other fungi.
Do you want to add anything, Tim, to that?
I can't beat that.
I think at the beginning I said two extraordinary minds. I'm sure all of your minds, like mine, completely spinning from everything that these two have been able to bring us. We could be here for many more hours, but it's time for a drink. And if you have another question, hopefully you two are going to stay for a drink so you can ask them in person. But thank you very much. Brilliant questions. And thank you two very, very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well done. You're brilliant.